but first of all, get your reaction to the decision by the Swedish prosecutor to drop the investigation.
Well, quite clearly that was the right thing to do, because after all, even subsequent to the interview that he did with the Swedish prosecutors last year, no charges have ever been preferred against Julian Assange. So, in the absence of charges, of course, the prosecution should be dropped. That was the right thing to do. Now, of course, as you say, he faces the prospect, most seriously, of a US extradition order to face charges of espionage in connection with the publication of US cables and intelligence information. Now, those charges are very, very serious. He could face 30 to 50 years in prison and the prospect of being abused and mistreated in prison, as happened to Chelsea Manning in the early days of her imprisonment. So these are really serious concerns for Julian Assange, and the US Attorney General Jeff Sessions only a month ago said that arresting Julian Assange is a priority. We know that there's evidence that a secret grand jury has already been convened, and the prospect of charges, therefore, I would say, is pretty imminent.
You were talking there about Chelsea Manning, the soldier who leaked that information to WikiLeaks. Her sentence was commuted under the previous administration. Julian Assange is not likely to face quite the same level of not sympathy, but at least he won't be treated as leniently by the Trump administration. Perhaps the 5 years he spent inside the Ecuadorian embassy might have been better spent in Sweden.
Well, of course, there is a big disparity between the way in which Chelsea Manning has been treated and the way in which Julian Assange has been treated. Chelsea Manning leaked the information. WikiLeaks and Julian Assange merely published it. So they weren't whistleblowers or leakers, they were publishers. So they've got the same status as the New York Times or the Guardian, who also published some of this information. So why the Trump administration is going after Julian Assange in particular doesn't make sense. It's not logical and it's not moral. And this, of course, highlights the fact that the key issue in this case is one of press and journalistic freedom. Should publishers, whether it be WikiLeaks or the New York Times, have the right to publish information which reveals wrongdoing by the US government and military? I believe they should have that right. I believe it's in the public interest, and I applaud them for doing it.
You are close to the campaign for Julian Assange. Have you had any contact with the team inside the Ecuadorian embassy? Is there any way you can gauge what they must be thinking now or what they're likely to do next?
I haven't had any contact in the last couple of days, so I simply cannot say.
Okay. If you were Julian Assange, knowing what we know about the Swedish prosecutors and what the Americans may or may not do, what do you think will be the next move? Because the Ecuadorians are putting diplomatic pressure on the United Kingdom to allow him safe passage to travel to Ecuador. Do you think that's likely to happen?
Well, of course, since he has claimed asylum, which is his right, under international law, he should be given free passage to go to Ecuador to seek refuge there, refuge that's been granted by the Ecuadorian government. So that would be the right thing to do, but all along in this case, I don't think the British or American governments have necessarily done the right thing. They've looked after their own particular interests, and they want to send a signal. They're using Julian Assange essentially to send a signal that you better not blow the whistle, you better not publish things, you better not get out of line, because we will come after you.
Julian Assange is a deeply divisive personality. He's a hero to many for publishing that information. He's a traitor to others for publishing that information. But certainly the groundswell of support that he enjoyed in the early days of WikiLeaks back to 2010 disappeared when these allegations of rape were brought against him. Do you think we will see a resurgence of that support for Julian Assange now that those allegations of rape and sexual assault have gone away?
Well, as much as I supported WikiLeaks and Julian Assange in revealing the kinds of human rights abuses that were perpetrated by US forces in Iraq and so on, I always said that he should face these sex allegation charges. They're very serious. He should face them. And of course, he was always willing to face them. You know, from the get-go, he initially went through a preliminary investigation where the Swedish prosecutor said there was no crime, there was no case to answer, and he was free to leave Sweden. It's only when a second prosecutor took up the case that the allegations were revived and the attempt to get him to Sweden was pursued. So, all those issues aside, I'm not in a position to say whether Julian Assange was guilty of any sexual crimes. If he was, of course, he should be punished. But the fact that he is not being prosecuted, the fact that there were never any charges laid against him, does not point to a strong legal case that he committed sex crimes. But we'll leave that in abeyance. The key thing right now is that WikiLeaks and Julian Assange have, over the years, performed very important public services in shining a light on information that governments had kept secret from the public. We, the people, have a right to know what governments are doing in our names. If it wasn't for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, we would have not known a lot of very important things. So in that sense of performing a public interest defence, I think that WikiLeaks and Julian Assange ought to be applauded.
Peter Tatchell, human rights campaigner and supporter of Julian Assange, thank you very much for joining us on Sky News. We have seen a photograph of Julian Assange he tweeted earlier, looking very relaxed and confident. It may well be that we may see him on that balcony sometime very soon.
OK, Ashish, thank you very much for the moment. Well, we haven't seen him appear on the balcony, but we do have some words now from Julian Assange. This is the very latest that we're hearing from the WikiLeaks founder. He says that he was detained for 7 years without charge while his name was slandered. He says, "I do not forgive or forget." So that's the very latest that we're hearing from Julian Assange. We hope to hear from him live later on. He might make an appearance, as I say, on that balcony. We'll, of course, bring that to you straight away as soon as it happens. In the meantime, let's take you to Peterborough, where the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is campaigning. Let's listen in.
Whole point of universal benefits. And if older people, some, a small number, have large incomes, they pay tax on it just like anybody else. That's the whole principle of a universal provision within our society. The second proposal